and some understanding to our theology so that we can put it into practice and really make our faith meaningful and come alive. So I want to sort of start today by taking a step back into chapter 4 and looking at these verses, and hopefully this will all make sense when we then move forward into chapter 5. But as I was preparing for this message, this sort of came to mind, and it really impressed upon me that, and by the way, a little bit of a rabbit trail. You know that the scriptures are inspired, but the chapter markings and the verse markings are not. Those are 100% human construction. So the fact that something ended at chapter 4 and now we're starting in chapter 5 may or may not be what James had in mind in terms of where he wanted us to start thinking, stop thinking, how the breaks are organized, how his information is collated, and probably because of that. James, more than many other books, has these series of we're bouncing all over the place in terms of the topics that we deal with. Anyway, if you want to turn back to James chapter 4, we'll sort of go forward here in looking at this. It says, "Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." And it was because of that phraseology that it sort of really caught my eye as I was looking at chapter 5. Because if ever there was a question of what my faith meant, that phraseology of drawing near to God has to be part of it. I've said multiple times that we serve a personal God that we can know personally and should know personally. He wants us to know him personally. And so this phraseology of drawing near to God is a very real part of making my faith real. So as I said, that's why it sort of struck me. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourself in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. Now, in trying to understand what seemed to me a bunch of double negatives, if you will, or things that didn't really connect, I turned, as I sometimes do, to the Message version of the Bible, which, as I've said, I personally, you can do whatever you want, of course, I personally don't recommend the Message as your primary Bible reading, but it's a good commentary because it really puts things very simply. And here's what the Message says about those exact verses. "So let God work his will in you. Yell aloud no to the devil and watch him scamper. Say a quiet yes to God and he'll be there in no time. Quit dabbling in sin. Purify your inner life. Quit playing the field. Hit bottom and cry your eyes out. The fun and games are over. Get serious, really serious. Get down on your knees before the master. It's the only way you'll get on your feet." And I loved the word picture that came out of that, the contrast of this believer who is sort of loud and boisterous in shaking his fist at the devil. And then the contrast to that is just sort of this quiet, just passive saying yes to God. And that's all God needs. Just a quiet yes. And he'll be there in no time. It says, quit playing the field, hit bottom, and cry your eyes out. Really is that image that I've been saying a couple times about what the definition of humility is. Remember that humility is having a right view of our standing. The opposite of humility is proud, which is having a wrong view of our standing, an elevated view of who we really are. And that's why this word picture really hit home for me. And then he goes on, and he's presenting this image of dabbling in sin. Now remember, James is talking to believers. And even though he's several times, twice that I can recall in the book of James, he says, well, I may be a murderer, but at least I'm not an adulteress. That's kind of serious there. Both of those, in terms of on the spectrum. But when I see this phraseology of dabbling in sin, I think of that. I don't know if you've ever done a study or read that book on the 7 respectable sins. The things that we believers do and do regularly, but it's still sin. That's the picture that I get here. this idea of purifying your inner life as a necessary condition for drawing near to God. It's almost like one begets the other. It's a synergistic process. So with that in mind, now let's go ahead and look at chapter 5 and round out this chapter, which is entitled, it starts off, Misuse of Riches. Now, I had to, again, because my mind wanders all over the place when I do these studies, I had to take a step back and reconnect things in my mind, because I was thinking through immediately when I started looking at chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, and the impression and the phraseology about riches that James has touched on several times in his book, and then, of course, there's many other verses about it. Back in James chapter 1, if we can think back 5 weeks ago, but the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away, and by extension the riches will pass away. And then in chapter 2, James says, "Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you who have dishonored the poor man," hold that phrase in your mind, "but you who have dishonored the poor man, is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court?" And as I explained back in chapter 2, this is not saying that automatically poor people are spiritual and rich people are not. That's not what James is saying here. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy, "For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil." So if someone tells you that money is the root of evil, it's not. It's the love of money. "And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Again, hold that phraseology in your mind. This equation that James is going to get into about having riches and misery is kind of one of the points that I want to draw here. Because, the idea, it's not money itself that's evil. Money is inanimate. It is neutral. Money by itself means nothing. It certainly means nothing to God. And it's not money that tempts us. Okay, that's an important consideration. Money itself cannot tempt you. Money itself does not cause evil. What causes evil are the three things that we've been talking about throughout the book of James. What causes evil is, first of all, our flesh and all the lusts that come with that. Second thing that causes evil is the world and everything that's wrapped up in our culture. And the third thing that causes evil, of course, is Satan. So our lusts, again, remember the natural man that we were talking about, the natural man in the mirror? Our flesh lusts after money and the things that it can buy in order to gratify the flesh. The world glorifies money, and it always has. You know, he who dies with the most toys wins, and all of that sort of thing. And then Satan, not a stupid guy, always has used wealth and everything that it represents and everything that comes with it. Again, the lust and that sort of thing, to take our focus away from God. And it's really easy to do. And that's why James spends a lot of time talking about the elevation of poor people, because they don't have the riches that would normally take us away from our focus on God. He's saying they're more blessed because they don't have that distraction. And Satan used that when Jesus was out in the wilderness. It wasn't specifically money. He was starving, and he said, here's some, gratify your flesh with some bread. Why don't you do that? Lust of the flesh. So, now we can dig, sort of a little bit of background there. Now we can really dig into chapter 5. "Come now, you rich." Now remember, okay, we don't maybe think of it this way because of our circumstances, but in the economy of the entire world, we are rich. Most average Americans are in the top 2% of the world in terms of wealth. So James is talking to us. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Now, again, the default position that James is assuming here is that people who are rich are in misery. And that's not universal, but it's a broad generalization. But nonetheless, when you look at the full context of riches and wealth and Scripture, again, it's not a sin to be rich, but unfortunately, the track record of the human race and the natural human condition when it comes to wealth is that mostly people who are rich sin a lot. They're certainly miserable. How? Well, broadly speaking and generally speaking, people who are rich and focused on it focus on preserving it. They focus on their wealth instead of focusing on God. They're generally unsatisfied with their wealth. There's something about wealth that no matter how much you have, you always have to have more. So that discontentedness. And it's much more prevalent to compromise when you have wealth and you want to either keep it or gain more. So you take your eyes off your morals, your values, what you know to be right. And with your prevalence, your focus on wealth and keeping it, that's what you view as your status. If that's where you place your focus, that's where you place your standard, then you view yourself based on your wealth, and so therefore you view other people who don't have it as lower than yourself. An improper view of our station. So the picture is proud independence. Okay, the two have been talking about this a couple times in James. What is the number one thing that God hates? Pride. This being willing to be apart from God, willing to find our fulfillment elsewhere, proud independence. Covetousness, greed leading to dishonesty. And then what James has also talked about, favoritism or prejudice. So it's almost like this, if I can paint a picture, if I can use these words that James brings out to paint a picture. On the one hand, and I'm generalizing. Please understand that I'm doing that, and I know it. But normally you don't have somebody who's on one side and the other. Normally we're either all on one side or we're all on the other. Or broadly, we're largely on one side or largely on the other. Proud independence on one hand, humble dependence on the other. Now, can a rich person be humbly dependent on God? And the answer is, of course they can. And we can think of many people, Milton Hershey, Truett Cathy, people who have exemplified that type of lifestyle. Yeah, they're wealthy, but they had a right view of their station, and they had a right view of where that wealth came from, and understand that they are 100% dependent upon God. So therefore, if you go down that right-hand side, they're broadly content, as opposed to being being desirous of more. Because when you're desirous of more, that seed in your heart of greed means you'll do anything to get more. So that greed leading to dishonesty, as opposed to people who are scrupulously honest, no matter how much it costs them. And then there's what we do with it. All of this would be bad enough if it was just internal. But it's not. Because life is always characterized by how we get along and interrelate with other people. So the guy at the left-hand side, the guy on the left-hand side is by and large going to be prone to favoritism. That picture again in James of the well-dressed guy with the rings. Here, you come in, you sit up front, even when it's not COVID. Just come, right here. Oh, you're poor? Well, look, we got a place for you over there. No love. And so what James is saying is, okay, if you take a look at this picture, broadly, generally speaking, who do you think is going to be happier? Someone who has covetousness? Someone who's dishonest? Someone who is prone to prejudice? You think they're really going to be happier? And that's why he says, come now, you rich. What goes along with that is weeping and howling for your miseries. Now, I think it was in 8th grade that I first heard this poem. And so it's the story of Richard Cory. If you remember that poem in high school literature class or whatever. I remember the poem. I don't remember who my literature teacher was. Nonetheless, here's what it says. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. He was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he had everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. Forgive the graphic ending, please. I'll blame the author. Don't blame Chris. Blame the author. He's the one who wrote it. And ironically, this was written back in 1897 or something like this. This is not a new thought. But it's this picture, this idea of, okay, don't be too envious of the rich, because it really and truly, generally, on the outside is only where they look happy. On the inside, they're misery. And that's exactly what James is talking about here. Not only do riches bring miserably, they generally don't really bring any good. Because James says, your riches have rotted. All that which you've placed such an emphasis on, it's rotted. Garments have become moth-eaten. Gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. So he says, remember the well-dressed man that we showed so much favoritism to? Moth-eaten. Remember how much we, supposedly depended on the wealth and everything that would give us? Rotted. Remember our precious possessions, gold and silver? Rusted. And James tells us those characteristics will testify against us. I mean, you know the drill. Again, I'm speaking to a mature church here. You know what's going to come at the end times. We're going to lay our crowns before the feet of Jesus. And then there's going to be a holy fire. And only that which was done for Jesus is going to be permanent. Clothing, gold, riches, wealth, possessions, all going to be burned up and gone. And that's what's going to testify against us. That's exactly what James is talking about here. All the stuff that we stored up, in the end, it's going to betray us. So, reading on. Let's see, where am I? Yeah, good. He says, behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. And again, the picture that James is painting here is that wealth has this way. And so not only is it impermanent, not only is it not even worth putting your foundation on, it poisons us. It has this way of making us greedy. And more importantly, it enslaves us. We become bound to it. And so the perception is, certainly the worldly perception, is that wealth makes you free. Wealth makes you independent. But the reality is, by and large, it's the wealth itself that makes us slaves. Proud independence from God is the typical characteristic of a wealthy person, as opposed to a humble dependence on God. And when you are proud and you feel independence, just a short step, hardly any distance at all, to arrogance, greed, and injustice. And James gives us this picture of a farmer who withholds back a portion of the laborer's wage. Why? So he can make even more money. Again, it's that greed. Now, here's a different example. This came to mind. And if I could sing it for you, I would. I can sing it, actually, but I won't. You don't want me to. If I had really worked on this and had enough, I would have asked Dave. Dave's got that deep, rich, voice that he would really, really sing this song really well. So I'll just say it, and when I start to say it, I'm sure that you'll recognize it, and you can put the melody together in your mind. Okay? I was born one morning when the sun didn't shine. I picked up my shovel and I walked to the mine. I loaded 16 tons of number 9 coal, and the straw boss said, "Well, bless my soul. You load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store." See, I knew you'd do it. It's an old song, but we're old people, right? All right, I'll leave that one alone. So Tennessee Ernie Ford made it a hit back in 1955. But what's the mental picture there? I can't go to heaven. I can't even afford to die because I owe my soul, everything to the company store. What is that a picture of? The company that I work for, it's not enough that they pay me minimum wage, but then, they make this store available that I become enslaved to, and they make even more money on that. That's the picture that James is putting here. Those who become rich or add to their riches by depriving people of what is due them, that's what James is trying to say. And then he goes on to say that it's the wages themselves that cry out to God. The withheld wages themselves are the ones that is what becomes the voice of judgment. He's not saying that the laborers are crying out. They may be, but he's not even saying that. He's saying the wages themselves that were unjustly withheld are crying out to God. And I thought of another story that reminded me of that. You're familiar with Cain and Abel. Genesis chapter 4, verses 9 to 10. "Where is Abel your brother?" God said. And Abel said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" God said, "What have you done?" Now, pause right there. When God asks, "What have you done?" do you think he doesn't know? He says, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." It's the same picture. And it says back in James in verse 4, it says, "The outcry of that blood, of that injustice, has reached the Lord of Sabaoth." Now that bears a little bit of explaining, because it's not the Lord of the Sabbath, which he is. This is the Lord of Sabaoth. And Sabaoth speaks to this idea that God has the power, the magistrate, if you will, the armies. He's the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord of the armies of heaven. He has all the power, all the police, all the whatever he needs in order to judge injustice. Now, when you connect those dots with what we know about the attributes of God, we know that God is, and that's how it works, by the way. You want to know what an attribute of God is? It's any blank that you can fill in. If you do God is, what's the most common one? Everybody already knows. God is love. Everybody always says that. I'd much rather focus on that than God is justice. It's a little more frightening. Because here's the thing about God's attributes. He can't be something one time and something else another time. He cannot not be just. And so he will respond to injustice. And what the Lord of the Sabaoth is saying, he has the power to do so. Justice will be required in some way, shape, or form. That's quite a deep warning that James gives us in that picture. So, all right, our checklist thus far. Riches often bring misery, because we depend on them instead of God. Riches often lead us astray to covetousness, greed, and injustice. And it would be okay, maybe that's not even the right way to put it, but it would be one thing if it were just one thing. But you normally get the whole package. And the third thing, the God of justice will judge the unrighteous. He can't not. So part 2, which the New American Standard Bible lists this last section as an exhortation, an encouragement, an urging encouragement, a strong encouragement. And for this, I'm going to borrow the words of another preacher, just to give credit where credit is due. I'm not the one who came up with this, but again, if you remember all the way back in December 29th, 2019, when I had the message on the 3 P's for successful, this message brought to you by the letter P. Well, not coincidentally, this last part of James, this exhortation, has 4 P's for successful Christian living. So we'll start in chapter 5, verse 7. It says, therefore be patient. I guess you can kind of figure out what the first P is. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, until it gets early and late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. Again, this is a continuation of what he was talking about before. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. So the first P is going to be patient. Now remember back in the first message section that we did on James chapter 1, and we were talking about the book of James as a focus on an entire way of life. Not just, Sunday morning, not just bits and pieces, but our entire way of life. James is a handbook for practical Christian living based on the fact that it's 24/7. And if you remember, the illustration that I used, or the comparison that I used, was that of a farmer. Now, many of us have Monday through Friday 9-to-5 jobs. A farmer is not like that. You can't just be a farmer just on Monday or, until 5 o'clock. If something needs doing, it needs doing. And James is extending that analogy. Be patient like the farmer. You don't plant today and harvest tomorrow. Look outside, okay? So I was driving down the road and just starting to notice. They're just starting to harvest the corn crop. But that wasn't planted yesterday. When is corn planted? May? June at the latest? Because what's the saying? Knee high by the 4th of July. So that's what, there's got to be coming before that. And James is saying, look, you got to be patient like that. What happens if you harvest too early? You either get not ripe tomatoes, corn, whatever it happens to be, or they're not even in existence or whatever. What happens if you harvest too late? So that's what James is saying. And then he goes on and he also uses the illustration. If he wants to talk about patience and endurance and the keep-goingness, the stick-to-itiveness, he uses the illustration of the prophets. And I went and looked up some of these because I knew it, but I didn't really know it. And the first thing I learned, Isaiah, like one of the most famous Old Testament prophets, he was sawn in half by Manasseh, the 14th king of Judah. I didn't know that. Jeremiah was stoned. 23 prophets, in fact, in the Old Testament, and 6 of them were martyred. So that's the type of endurance, of patience, of stick-to-itiveness that James is using. And again, he's, you got to remember. So the book of James is one of the earliest books in the New Testament that was written. So the scripture that he would have pointed to would be the Old Testament. And because he's writing to believers, they would have been well familiar with it. Keep going. But above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or with any under oath. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. So the second P is purity. And I'll explain why. Because here again, James he's got several themes that he keeps going back to, and one of them is the tongue. So now he's talking about the words that come out of your mouth. And James has said throughout his book, what is in your heart will come out of your mouth. What is in my heart will come out of my mouth. And so he's saying, don't add words to your words. Don't add phrases like, I swear to God. Just say yes, or just say no. My wife and I like to watch crime shows, and they must have the same writers for all of the crime shows because, the detectives, he's got a suspect, he brings him into the interrogation room, and the person denies that he did whatever the crime was, and he says, I swear to God. And I just want to write an episode one time where the detective says, oh, okay, well, I really thought you were guilty until you swore to God that you weren't. So now I'm going to let you go. But they haven't called me yet. You know who can say, I'm innocent? The person who's innocent, the pure of heart. And adding, I swear to God, or not adding, I swear to God, is not going to change the fact of who I am. So the second P is purity. The third P you can, again, probably guess. James is pretty clear. That's why I love his book. Is any among you suffering? Then he must pray. Is anyone cheerful? He is to sing praises. Is any among you sick? Then he must call for the elders of the church, and they are to pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will restore the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, they will be forgiven him. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. The effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. Then he prayed again, and the sky poured rain, and the earth produced its fruit. So the third P, prayer. And James gives us a checklist. It's really kind of cool. You're suffering? Pray. Cheerful? Pray. Sick? Pray. Sins? Pray. No rain? Pray. Too much rain? Pray. And that's what he gives us. Now, last week, when we were talking about prayer, James gave us two ends of the spectrum, if you will. He said, on the one hand, you have not because you ask not. So this end of the spectrum is no prayer. Over here, he says, you pray, but you pray for things that your flesh is lusting after so you can spend it on your flesh. So you're not going to get that prayer. But the reality is the sweet spot right in the middle of, yes, prayer, but the right kind of prayer is what James is warning about here or urging to here. And I don't have time to do it. This would be a whole rabbit trail, a whole message, or even a series of messages on prayer. But I'll just echo the words of what Martin Luther said. He said, to be a Christian without prayer is no more possible than to be alive without breathing. So, next one is prayer. Last one, my brethren, if any among you strays from the truth and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sin. And James's final point here, almost to me brings this full circle. Because remember back in chapter 3, James is saying, don't be a teacher. Or at the very least, he's saying, be careful about being a teacher. And here he's saying the exact opposite. He's saying, be a teacher. Encourage one another. And if necessary, confront one another. Seek the truth. And speak the truth in love. And through that love, perhaps turn a sinner from his ways and save his soul from death. How do we do that? Well, of course, we take out our Bibles and we thump them on the head. Bum, 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 bum. Preach about? No, of course not. That's not how we do it. I have a friend who's a diabetic, but he also loves Philly cheesesteaks, as do I. Carbs. He loves chocolate cake, as do I. Carbs. He loves pasta, as do I. Carbs. Caramel popcorn, carbs. So it's not love for me to let him eat those carbs. It's love to say, let's not eat this cheesecake. And so we help one another. And that, by the way, is why James says it covers a multitude of sins, his and mine. So our final checklist is this: strengthen our heart and our faith through patience. You want to know how to live a practical Christian life? You want to know how to put this to meaning? What does my faith mean? Well, one thing it means is patience. What does my faith mean? Well, another thing it means is purity, being pure on the inside. What does my faith mean? Prayer. What does my faith mean? The ability to persuade, the ability to speak the truth. So faith lives through patience, prayer, and love. As the worship team comes on up, I'd like to tell you a story. A little bit of a rabbit trail, but not really. I didn't coordinate this with Jules, and she did not coordinate this with me. It just worked out that way. And perhaps, I'm sure you've probably heard this story. It's about a guy by the name of Horatio Spafford, who lived in Chicago in the time period of and right after the Civil War. And the first thing that happened to him was that his 4-year-old child died tragically. And not too many years after that, Horatio Spafford was a lawyer, prominent lawyer, wealthy lawyer in the city of Chicago. He attended Dwight Moody's church. He was a Confederate, a compatriot, if you will, of D.L. Moody. But he had invested heavily in real estate in Chicago, right up until 1871, when there was the Great Chicago Fire that essentially wiped out all of his real estate holdings. And so he decided, along with his wife, just a little while after that, that what they needed was a vacation. So rather than go to Ocean City, Maryland, where he should have gone, no, I'm kidding, he went, the thing to do which people did back then was he took a trip to Europe. But business things happened, and he sent his wife and 2 or 3, can't remember, daughters on ahead. And that ship that they were on ran into another ship and sunk almost immediately. When his wife ultimately made it to Europe, she sent a telegram back to Horatio, 2 words: saved alone. Horatio, of course, immediately booked the next, not flight, booked the next boat to Europe. And the captain, who was aware of the circumstances, was kind enough to say, hey, we're going over right now where the tragedy took place. And it was at that spot, at that moment, that Horatio Spafford wrote the beginnings of the words to the song that we're about to sing.
Us.